Okay, we're going to be taking a look at this comic book collection and doing the analysis. We're going to be covering several different things in this video. But let me, just before I get started, say don't fast forward through this video to the end. Watch the entire thing. This collection was important to Kevin, so we're going to spend a few minutes examining it and talking about it a little bit and putting some context around the analysis. So I'm going to be covering the history of comic books, how to grade a comic book, what I found in this collection, and then we're going to talk about the value of it. So let's get started. First, we're going to hit the history. When comic book books first came out, they were a lot like newspapers. You would read it and throw it away. Nobody really kept their comic books. But then the people in the 30s and 40s and 50s got into the 70s. They had some extra money to spend, and they were nostalgic for their childhood. They started looking for things from their childhood, including comic books. So they were purchasing comic book quite a bit in the 70s. And a guy named Robert Overstreet saw this happening. He started recording what comic books were being purchased for. And he put together in the 70s the first price guide that helped people figure out what a comic book might be worth based on what people were paying for it. That helped markets to become in the 1980s. People started looking through their old attics and finding all these old comic books and realizing, hey, these things are worth some money. So the market for sellers and buyers was formed. In 1985, to facilitate these markets, a whole bunch of comic books started opening up, comic book stores. And these comic book stores, they seemed like they were opening up on every corner. Every town, every city, every place had comic book stores opening up, cashing in on this market that was growing, where comic books, sometimes if you hit the right comic book, could be worth quite a bit of money. Lots of these comic book stores opened up. The comic book publishers made deals with these comic book stores because all these comic book stores wanted the comics, the new ones that were being published. So the publishers said, okay, we'll deliver you comics every month, but you have to keep whatever you don't sell. Don't send it back to us. And the comic book owners thought, hey, no problem there. If it doesn't sell, I'll put it in my own personal collection. The values of these things are going up so quickly, I'll hold on to it for a year and it'll be worth a lot more. So I've got no problem with that condition. But what that set up was a situation where the comic book publishers were insulated from the demand of the market. As far as the publishers knew, they were just sending their comic books out to all these stores. The stores were seeing what was actually happening with the market. What was happening is the market was getting saturated with comics. There's only so many people out there who are going to buy comics. They only have so much money to spend. What was left over, the owners had to eat. Well, after several years of this, owners could no longer afford to eat all these comic books. They had piles and piles of them stocked up in their back room in their warehouses, and they just could not afford it anymore, and they started going bankrupt. So in 1993, with the bankruptcy of all these comic stores, bookstores, the market started to crash. Now, the comic book stores would go out of business, and you'd walk in the back room, see all of these pristine comic books that had never been opened before. Some of them were still in the shipping boxes from the publisher. What's the comic book store owner going to do with it? They're out of business now. Well, they were selling these comic books for pennies on the dollar. Suppose I had a comic from 1990 and it's worth $5. Comic book store goes out of business and dumps 100 of them on the market for 10 cents each. Well, now nobody's going to come to me and pay $5 for that comic book when the market is flooded with 10-cent versions of that comic. The market just crashed. Comic book stores continued falling off the map as a result of this. People started turning away from the comic books as they realized all this money they were putting into it was a waste. It impacted the comic book publishers. You take a look at DC or Marvel, who's the big comic book makers. To keep from going out of business, they had to start licensing their product out to theme parks, and they also licensed it out for movies. But even that wasn't enough to save a company like Marvel. It wasn't until Disney stepped in and scooped up Marvel, got a great deal on it, turned Marvel into a movie powerhouse, which is what Disney does, that Marvel was saved. The point of this is just to say comic book market was booming and then it crashed. It got into the, what some people call the dark periods of comic book collecting, when people who thought they had hundreds or maybe thousands of dollars worth of comic books almost overnight found that their comic books weren't even worth what paper they were printed on. That's the history of the comic books. How do you determine what a comic book is worth? Well, it depends on the age, depends on the grade, depends on the Overstreet guidebook, and it also depends what somebody is willing to pay. So these are the ages: Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, and Modern Age. Here is the CBCS certification grading. There's a couple of different grading methodologies, but they're all follow pretty much the same thing. There's mint, near mint, very fine, fine, very good, good, and then the rest. For the purpose of what I did, I've only graded to very fine, fine, very good, and good, as I really don't think there's anything better than very fine in this collection. I'll get into that in a moment. And if it's not at least good, it's not even worth talking about. This just provides help scoring or grading the comics. This is another tool that's used to tell how many defects a comic can have and still yet be very fine, good, so on. How do you know how much a comic book is worth? Well, it says here the values listed in the price guides are irrelevant and basically worthless. A collectible is worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. So when Overstreet first produced his book, it was the only source out there to determine what a comic book was worth. But now we have the internet. Things change from day to day, but that guide is only printed once a year. So people, yeah, they'll look at the price guide to kind of get an idea. Yeah, it really comes down to you put it out there. What is somebody willing to pay for it? In this example, there's an All-Star Comics, the price guide down here. In the corner says it's worth $42, but here August 13th it sold for $2. Over here August 17th it sold for $22.50. So depending on the day, depending upon who's looking at it, there's huge variation, and neither of those sales touched what the price guide said, which was $42. I called up a friend of mine, Theron Humphrey. He used to own a comic book store in Corning, New York. I was talking to him about this collection, and this is what he told me. He says, those exposed to soot, I'll be talking a little bit more about that. These comic books were exposed to some kind of a fire or something. There's grime on them. It looks like they've got soot on them. And the problem is they've been kind of rubbing together. So if some of them had soot, now it's spread throughout the whole collection. Okay, those exposed to the soot should be considered soiled. Come up with a rough total and then knock another 25% off of that. Knocking the 25% off is because there's some restoration that has to happen due to that soot being on there. Sometimes you can't restore it. You might be able to, you might not. And there's a risk there, and there's also a cost. There's labor involved in trying to clean some of that up. Once you've taken that 25% off, if you're looking to sell them, expect a shop to pick and choose, offering 40 to 60% off of that value. But if you're looking to sell the entire lot, it could be considerably less. Another site told about this resale value, when you sell a whole lot or you sell it to a shop that's going to have to resell it. If you sell in bulk, you'll get half of what it's worth. You'll get half the value. And somebody else says you'll end up selling it to a dealer, and the dealer will pay you a fraction of what the comic is worth. That plays into determining the value here. Here's some costs to consider. The soot damage. Like Theron said, 25%. Resale value, they're going to take 40 to 60% off of that because they have to pay you and then resell it and make money. Bagging and boarding. All these comic books should have been bagged and boarded, and they weren't. That explains why, in part, why they are in such horrible condition. And bagging and boarding costs about between 10 cents and 15 cents for each comic. And then boxing for storing. These were not boxed. They were just tossed into a huge tub. Boxing costs about 8 cents per comic. And then if you're going to sell a comic, it's going to cost between $3 to $4 to ship it. A lot of times you can get the person buying it to pay for the shipping. But if they're buying a $2, $3 comic book, they're not going to pay $3 to have it shipped to them. Either you have to sell your comic books in bulk amounts, in which case you're only going to get a fraction of what it's worth, as we saw on the other page, or you're going to have to eat that shipping costs yourself. And then there's also the restoration costs and the time. The restoration, we've talked about the soot. There's also flattening that has to be done. Some of these are curled really bad. There's different restoration activities that can happen. It's time consuming. Okay, so here's my initial reaction when I first sat down and looked at these comic books. They're covered in grime, soot. We talked about that already. There were candy wrappers in the boxes, and the candy wrappers were sticky, and they were stuck to the comic books. It was really gross. The comics were filthy. I had to scrape boogers off of these comic books. They were stuck together. There was soiling and dirt that I had to take off. Some of the stuff was really, really gross. The odor, it smelled awful. Some kind of liquid got spilt on some of these comic books. They're not taken care of very well. They're folded, they're bent, they're damaged. They were stored comics. If they're stacked on top of each other, it will cause something called a rolled binding. Many of these suffer from that because they were laid flat and stacked on top of each other. That's a big no-no. Some of these comics were still in their shipping bags, and you'd think, hey, that's good. But the shipping bags are not meant for long-term storage. The shipping bags were deteriorating and shredding. My whole house is covered in this shredded plastic as a result of that. There was no organization of how they were thrown in the box. And most of these comic books are from the modern age. So that was my initial reaction looking at these. When you are selling into a collector. Okay, let's say we're not going to sell to a dealer, we're going to sell to a collector. A collector is going to expect the comic book to be boarded in plastic, which means the board on the back, the whole thing is inside of a plastic bag, and it had been stored in a box. Okay, we know none of that happened. So in the upper left corner, you can see this is an example of a boarded and bagged comic. Over on the right side, you can send comics off to have them certified. When they get certified, they get sealed inside of this hard plastic container. That's kind of expensive to do, but that's what collectors are looking for. You saw what the collectors are going to expect, and now let's take a look at what I found. Here's some examples of comic books that are just really badly folded. When they fold, it causes a crease. A lot of times it breaks the paint on or the ink on the cover, causing a line through it. Really detracts the value. Over here's an example of some liquid was spilt. Here's a really bad fold. How they were stored, definitely not flat. Over here, another example inside the container. Down here, this is the soot damage that we're talking about. This should all be white, and you can see it's not. This is really, really bad. And same here, you can see the soot damage. It's easy to see the soot damage when the background is white. It's more difficult to see it when it's not white, such as orange area or this black area, unless you hold it up to a really strong light, and then you can see the soot. The soot is there, okay? The soot didn't just sprinkle on the white areas and not anyplace else. It's on top of the entire comic book. It's there. You can kind of see it a little bit on this white. It doesn't stand out quite as good in this picture. And then over here on the right is another way they were stored in the tub, all folded up. If you compare that to this, condition, bagged and boarded, compared to what you see here, it's not really what looking for. You're at a disadvantage because a lot of these are modern age, which aren't worth the paper that they're printed on, and they aren't stored very well. And they've got the soot damage going on. So the effort I put into this so far, I got about 70 hours in, maybe a little more. I put in new storage tubs, got the latest price guide, deodorized and cleaned. I had to do that. I mean, it just stunk so bad. I had to air these out. Sorted, organized, alphabetized, inventoried, and priced onto a spreadsheet, which I'm happy to share with you. And I graded about 20% of the comics. I'm not a professional grader, but I think I'm pretty good at it. Grading takes a lot of time. To do 20% of the comics, just to get a sampling, more or less, was quite a bit of effort. Okay, the results. What are the ages of these comic books? Like I've said, they're mostly modern. 67% are that modern age, which is after 1985, after, leading up to and after the market crashed, when the market was saturated with comics. Now, one comic happens to be Silver Age. So that was a surprise. That's from the 1960s. Comic books with value. So 75% of these comic books have absolutely no value whatsoever, according to the Overstreet comic book guide. They're worthless. Take them to the campfire and use them to start your fires if you wanted to. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bag and board them and put them into storage, and maybe my grandkids will find them, and maybe at that time they'll be worth something. So I'm going to make an offer for those comic books. 25% of the comic books are worth something, and we'll be getting into what that is. And when I present these dollar numbers, it's going to be a combination of the 75% that's worth nothing and the 25% that's worth something. Grading, the majority of these are very good rated comic books. Now, very good sounds, oh, wow, awesome. No, it's not. Okay. Below very good is good, and then poor. And poor is throw them away. Most of these are very good. Very few of them are very fine. Some of them are fine, but most of them are graded as very good. Now it's time for the game show. What we're going to do now is we're going to reveal these values, and we want this total to go above zero. Right now it's at a negative $177 because that's what it's going to cost to bag and board these comic books. The bag and boarding is essential and should have been done. It hasn't been done, and so we need to get that done. And that's going to cost $177. Also figured into here, as Theron Humphrey said, soiled reduction. You got to take that 25% off of whatever you think it is due to the soot damage. And then the resale value, when we sell these, somebody's going to have to make money on them. You got that 50% discount there. Okay, let's start rolling through these. I'm going to start with G and work my way up. G is the newest comic books, the most recent comic books. We're going to go all the way up to A. Our goal again is to try to get this above 0. Okay, still not above 0. Here we go, 129, negative 129. So if we were to stop here, you'd have to pay me $129 to haul these out of here. 125, negative 125. Ooh, getting 115. This this isn't going very well, is it? Oh, well, okay, there we go. Got into the modern C. Those 141 brings us up to a negative $10. So all we have to do is make $10, $11. We're going to break even here. Oh, there we go. Now that helped us out quite a bit. This is worth almost $100 now. So let's continue. See where this lands. Okay, good. $135. So this green is, this after all the subtractions and all that other stuff. This is what I'm recommending to offer for these comic books. If we were to stop here, $135. So you're making some money. Congratulations, that's pretty good. But let's continue on. We're going to jump over the bronze, go right to silver. There's only one book in silver, and it happened to be worth $9. Can you imagine one comic book worth $9? Well, it was. So that takes us to a positive 135. Now let's bring in the bronze, and holy cow, look at that. Bronze actually ended up being pretty good for us. Takes us to a total of $650. So that is awesome. But wait, there's more. Okay, you got one comic book in here, and going through the comics, it's like looking for that treasure, that needle in the haystack, and I found it. And it was Amazing Spider-Man number 300. I'm estimating it's worth $126. It's got quite a bit of damage on the back cover. It's got a few issues on the front cover, but I'm estimating it to be $126. I'm going to send it out for professional grading and sealing, which is going to cost about $25 to $45. Now, if I don't, and I just put this out on eBay, what it's tracking to be is around $124 to $118. But if I can get it professionally graded and put in this hard plastic, what I'm seeing out here on eBay is $2,400. Now, granted, that was a near mint or a mint 9.8, which we are not there. We're probably more like 6 or a 7, which puts us, here was a 5.5 that sold for $180, a 7.5 that sold for $285. We'll probably come somewhere there in the middle for a $25 to $45 investment, and then come back with $220. That's not so bad. I'm recommending we do that, and we'll split the proceeds from that one comic book. Unfortunately, the next best comic book highest value is only like $35, and it's not worth it. You look at these costs to get this done, it's not worth it. Bottom line here, I'm offering $650 for 1,612 comic books. We'll get the one comic book professionally graded and sold, and we'll split those proceeds. And I'm also going to offer a little bit of a guarantee here, some profit sharing for the next 12 months. And what that means is if I take any of these comic books and I sell them, and I get more than what I have estimated on the spreadsheet, and again, I'm happy to share that spreadsheet with you guys. If I get more than what that spreadsheet, I'll split that with you guys. We'll go 50-50 on that. So if I said a comic book was worth, $5, and I actually was able to get 10 out of it, we'll split that extra 5 in half, and $250 each. So anyways, so that's a profit sharing, kind of a little guarantee. Helps you know that if I made a mistake or something, you're not going to get ripped off for it. So that's the presentation. Thank you for sitting through it.